Let's bring in Mr. Jason Unruhe. He's a political commentator as well as analyst who is joining us via Skype out of Ontario. Jason, it's good to see you again. Tell me what you make of President Trump's comments. And on the one hand, he's speaking of basically keeping the flow of oil in the world market, and at the same time, he seems to be posing America as the guardian of Saudi Arabia in parts of his comments.
Well, this is something to be expected, that the United States would come to the aid of Saudi Arabia. Obviously, the links between the two countries go back a very long time. There's very much a great deal of money that flows between the Saudi royalty and the U.S. government, as well as a great deal of investments in both countries back and forth. But we should not be under any kind of illusion. This is very much just an excuse to demonize Iran. Very clearly, this was an act by Yemen, a rightful one against Saudi Arabia, which has been declaring a brutal, long war on it for years that has been essentially one-sided. And this comes, not long after bin Salman had stated that Saudi Arabia would be fine and that they had made previous claims that the oil refineries or the oil industry in general would be fine. They would not. They were not within the targeting capabilities of the Yemeni forces. And then, of course, the Yemeni forces now just prove them wrong with their capability of striking. This idea that somehow Iran was behind it, I think it's going to be very interesting to see what kind of proof that Saudi Arabia can come up with, given the fact that Iran was very clearly not involved. And the Houthis have already said that they are very much behind the attack, and they have every reason to be behind the attack. They have every capability of carrying out the attack. It's just completely nonsensical that they would just completely turn around and blame Iran for this. Now, obviously, Iran is sympathetic to the rebels inside of Yemen. That's not a secret. But that's a very far cry from accusing them of being behind the attack. If that were true, this would make this a very major international incident. But as it is, it would be very clear from the outset that this was Iran. But this just simply is not the case. And I would look forward to seeing what kind of evidence that Saudi Arabia could put forward in this case, given the very loftiness and virtual non-existence of any evidence against any claimed activities against Iran. I think that it's strange that the U.S. would claim to be the guardians of the world oil price, considering that they've caused a great deal of destabilization across the world for that very same resource. And we could look at that in the invasions of the last several countries, Iraq, Afghanistan, related to oil pipelines, their destabilization efforts in Syria, the non-stop aggression against Venezuela, etc. If this were really the case, then why would the U.S. considerably carry out destabilization efforts over the world oil price? I mean, of course, this is all linked right back to the petrodollar. But I think in this case, this is very clearly an incident that the United States and Saudi Arabia is going to use as justification for further hostilities against Iran.
You know what? Like you said, Yemen has all the reason actually and capability to do what it did. But even for a split second, just imagine that Iran was behind it. You know, what is this rhetoric used by President Trump? I mean, like, Iran and the U.S. have their own issues. If they wanted to basically use force against Iran militarily, I mean, there would be bigger reasons for which America has not started. Many people would consider that as not being able to start a war against Iran. Let alone for something like what's happened to Saudi Arabia, a confrontation with Iran, I mean. So what is that language he's using that we're waiting for Saudi Arabia to come up with, as to who they think, was behind it? It very much, Jason, reminds me of when the Saudi tankers were blown up and they were looking for, people other than the Yemenis to be behind them.
Well, I think that the language is very suspicious. I think that this is probably a very deliberate tactic on the part of the United States. I think that the U.S. is looking for a justification to carry out these hostilities, maybe looking for a straight up justification for attacking Iran. In this case, in my view, what I think is going to happen is that there's going to be some allegation of this evidence that points to Iran, and then that's going to be discovered or manufactured, etc., by Saudi Arabia and then handed over to the United States to be used as a justification for exactly what. Yet it's hard to tell with this administration, considering that the Trump administration does flip-flop a great deal on important events like these. But in the end, the United States government will say, well, it's not our intelligence, it's what Saudi Arabia gave us. Therefore, if anything the U.S. does in this situation, it would be denounced by the international community, etc., could then be laid on the door of the Saudis for their own faulty intelligence, which is very interesting considering that we saw the so-called intelligence behind the invasion of Iraq back in 2002.
And Jason, one other thing before I let you go. Right now, in the first part of his comments, he is referring to America being able and ready to make up for the loss of Saudi oil in the market. And right now, we have Iran's oil transactions sanctioned, and then we have Saudi Arabia's Aramco basically reduced to half of its capacity, and America says that I'm going to basically, make up for that. Don't you think it's bluff? Or if it's not a bluff, how long will it be able to do that? Because I imagine they have said this because they want to basically keep the oil market from fluctuation.
Oh, certainly, the stability in any market is very important to sustaining just about any industry that has ever existed. I don't really know how much the U.S. has in the way of stockpiles. I think that in terms of oil, there's a considerable amount. But I find this claim to be a little bit suspicious considering the U.S. doesn't really import that much oil from Saudi Arabia. In fact, the last time I checked, the largest customer was actually China. And this would no doubt cause a great deal of headache for them. But we are talking about the larger global market in general.
Right.
And that kind of stability is very important, considering that this is also a weapon that's being used against Venezuela. As you recall, several years ago, there was a great deal of a drop in the oil massive drop in the price, but increase in the amount of oil that was produced in the world. And I believe that this was something that was done deliberately to harm both the economies of Russia and Venezuela. So it's the U.S. is saying that they're looking for this kind of stability for the global market. Meanwhile, at home, they're also talking about drilling in places that were previously forbidden to do so for environmental reasons.
Of course, yes. That's Mr. Jason Unruhe. He's a political commentator and analyst that is out of Ontario via Skype. Thanks for your time, Jason.